Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for joining this Health Tech World Roundtable. The subject, as you know, today is AI, big data, and the role that it has to play in healthcare and health technology. We're really pleased that so many people are joining us today in the audience. We're streaming this live, and the discussion that we have today will be posted up on YouTube. So for all those watching, please share it as widely as you can. We've got a fabulously distinguished and diverse panel today with us that are going to engage with the topic and the discussion that we're about to have. If you're in the audience and you've got areas of particular interest or questions that you would like to hear the panel discuss or give their views on, then please do put your questions in chat, and we'll try and make sure that over the course of the next 90 minutes or so, we'll finish the discussion at 12 o'clock or a little bit before. We'll make sure that we get time to cover those topics and air some of those questions. So I'd like to now introduce our panel. I'm going to ask our panel members to introduce themselves, say a little bit about who they are, the organisations, businesses, or interests that they either represent or involved with, and say a few words about their particular area of interest or specialism, which will really sort of tee up the discussion that we're going to have today. So I'm going to ask Gil first to introduce himself, and then I'll ask the other panelists to do so as well. So Gil, maybe if you could say a few words about yourself and your areas of interest, please.
Thank you so much, Alistair, and thank you so much for moderating this conversation today, and to our friends from Health Tech World for bringing us all together. It's extremely appreciated, and I think this is an important conversation that we're about to engage in, and I look forward also to our participants, our audience's questions. I'm sure that they'll be illuminating. I'm Gil Bash, and I am the chair of Global Health and Purpose at Fin Partners, a global communications organization. But the cherished role I have here today actually is one of Health Tech World's original correspondents. I write for the platform, areas of science. I also serve on a variety of boards that are very interested in the area of artificial intelligence, including patient organizations like Let's Win for Pancreatic Cancer, industry organizations like the Gallion Foundation, which bestows upon people the Prix Gallion Award, mHealth Israel, which is really in the forefront of innovation around the world, and other organizations. So I look at this from various different perspectives. What I find so interesting about artificial intelligence, and I'm looking forward to engaging our other experts, is the aspect of moving our health system from really a sick care system to a health system. I think that mostly our expertise is directed toward helping people once they're ill, as opposed to looking or harnessing data to prevent illness in the first place. So Alistair, thank you very much for inviting me, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks very much, Gil. Can I ask Simon to introduce himself, please?
Thanks, Alistair. Simon Alexander Legg. I'm Managing Director of Tyson & Blake. Having studied economics with over 25 years experience in banking now, I spent the first half of my career working at bulge bracket, major Wall Street institutions, and since moved closer to working alongside my clients, our investors, our partners, directly in the startup companies that we've been invested in. Now, at Tyson & Blake, we're particularly interested in working together with inspirational founders and leaders of growth companies with unique approaches and innovative technologies who share our goal to make a profound contribution to society. In particular, and we love the way you phrased it, Gil, moving into health, we like the expression moving from healthcare to self-care. We particularly like technologies and approaches and innovations that help empower the individual, that help us better manage our own personal health, nutrition, and well-being.
Thank you for that introduction, Simon. And I know we'll come back to touch on the subjects that both you and Gil touched on there in much more detail. John from Sunderland University.
Hi, thanks very much for inviting me along. Thanks, Alistair. So I'm Professor John Murray, and I'm the Academic Dean for the Faculty of Technology here at the University of Sunderland. For those who don't know where we are, we're in the northeast of the UK, just below Newcastle, a big city there. And my interest predominantly started, you can probably see some of my friends in the background with robots, is around human-robot interaction and the applications of AI into robotics. And more so in later years, kind of looking at the ethics of AI and the ethics of machine learning and deep learning, and also looking at how we accept that technology into society. There's always a kind of worry or reluctance of the unknown, and particularly around machine learning and AI, which can be thought of very much as a black box. You know, what's going on inside those algorithms is how we reassure public, how we reassure people that we can use AI, machine learning to solve a lot of our world problems. So I'm very interested in ethics and acceptance of those technologies in society. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, John. If we can move on to our other John Taysom from Privitar, please.
Yes, well, thank you very much for inviting me along. I don't represent Privitar on this panel. I founded the company based on some work I did at Harvard in 2010, 2011 on privacy preserving data techniques, but I'm not speaking for them today. So my background is a long career working for Reuters, which is both a media company and also provides data finance, but I'm neither a journalist nor a banker. And so I feel very qualified to talk on the subject of medicine, though I'm not a doctor. And what I've been focused on most of my career is really how you collect data, how you store it, how you analyze it and make decisions from it. And I was involved in the very first wave, well, maybe that's not true, maybe the second wave of artificial intelligence back in about the early 90s, advising the London Power Application Centre. So my interest is to be the resident skeptic, because although AI is wonderful, it is also a bit like the Holy Roman Empire, which you may recall was neither holy nor in Rome nor an empire, and artificial intelligence is neither artificial nor is it intelligent. So you'll forgive me if from time to time I am the resident skeptic.
I think all good discussions, John, need a resident skeptic, so I'm glad that you're going to fulfill that role. You were very quick to point out you weren't a banker or a journalist, I know, so thank you for reassuring us on both of those counts. If I can come on next to Offer, please.
Yes, thank you, Alistair, and good morning, everyone. Offer Sharon, I'm the CEO of OnCost, which I'll tell you about in a second. I am a physician, an internist by training, spent the last 20 years in the industry, mostly as founder of companies, founded 3 companies. All of them are working on this border of what we call today AI, big data, machine learning, you name it, and medicine and the clinical applications of those. So one company in hemodynamics, one company in mental health, and OnCost, which is combining proteomics and machine learning tools in order to analyze resistance mechanisms of cancer. The company is about to launch a product later this year in the US, later in Israel. And I think that I'm coming from this direction of AI is not objective. AI for me is a tool. OnCost is a biology company. And we try to use AI, and I really relate to what John said about the black box approach, and how to prevent it, and how to convince clinicians and oncologists that what we provide them is something that they can actually trust. So one of our biggest challenges and areas of interest moving forward.
Thank you for that, Offer. And last but not least, Aman.
Yes, hi. Thank you for having me, Alistair. Aman Badi. I'm the Senior Vice President of AliveCore Biopharma, or the group at AliveCore that partners with the biopharmaceutical industry. I'm a physician by training, similar to Ofer. where I've spent my entire career in the pharmaceutical industry. This conversation is actually very near and dear to our hearts at AliveCor, where we have a AI-enabled EKG platform. I'll show my device here. It's our 6-lead EKG device, the world's only 6-lead ECG device that is able to detect 6 different arrhythmias. And so obviously for us, algorithms are what we focus on in developing more and more. Our device is able to detect atrial fibrillation, which is a major risk factor for stroke, as well as we are working on more and more algorithms to detect various different cardiac conditions, those that may be helpful in patients that are suffering from non-cardiological conditions, where perhaps you can use our device for monitoring for cardiac side effects of oncology medicines and other medications that may have life-threatening conditions associated with QT prolongation or other types of arrhythmia. So we are very excited to be here and share our point of views in this discussion, and look forward to the conversation. So thank you for having me.
Great, thank you very much, Aman. Gil, I'm going to come back to you really to start the discussion rolling, because I think all of us are interested in this concept of moving from healthcare to self-care. It's a nice way to describe it. Could you maybe expand a little bit on your thoughts and views about the role that data and artificial intelligence has to play in that journey to people taking more responsibility for informed decisions about their health and their lifestyle?
With pleasure, Alistair. And I also want to, I'm sure that Simon will want to jump in here as well. It's a topic near and dear to his heart. The challenge we're facing, and I would not be surprised if this doesn't pop up again and again, actually, I think starts with the concept of artificial intelligence, which makes us feel that this is not intelligence at all. It's artificially created. And if it were called adjunctive or adjunct intelligence or composite IQ, we might have a better chance of embracing it from both a clinician and a consumer standpoint. The reality is, and people will correct me if I'm wrong, I think between 70 and 80% of mortality, deaths in the world result from non-communicable diseases, heart disease, diabetes, cancer, respiratory disease, mental health aspects. And these are the biggest killers of humanity. Disease is the biggest oppressor of humanity. And what happens is, because we don't use composite wisdom, we don't use the totality of wisdom available to us, we seem to approach each person who is at risk as an N of one, a one-off. Composite intelligence, what we're terming in this conversation, artificial intelligence, and actually could give us the tools to engage people during our health planning visits and speak to them about their trajectory of their wellness or their lack of wellness. In the United States, and some will disagree, and I invite disagreement, our primary care medicine system has collapsed. It's become a walk-in clinic. And it's because the consumer no longer feels value in walking into a general physician or a primary care physician, because they don't understand what they're getting, return on investment, for their 40 minutes waiting in the waiting room and then waiting in sort of a little office to see a doctor for 9 minutes. If that visit were worth something, in other words, it was a planning visit, a strategy visit for wellness, probably consumers would be much more engaged in the value. So first, I see artificial intelligence. I'll stick to the term that we're using here, but I mean many things. Artificial intelligence actually is the bridge. Intelligence, information, conversation is the bridge between the physician, the preventive care physician, and their customer, the patient, in making good planning steps for the future. Without that, it seems to the consumer that each visit is a one-off piece of guesswork. So I think our conversation today, Alistair and everyone, has great, I'll call it public health import. It's beyond the technology itself. It's actually looking at re-inviting the consumer to be part of their health trajectory.
Thanks, Gil. Simon, Gil mentioned, and I think you mentioned that this was a particular area that you were focused on. Would you like to add anything to Gil's comments about that journey from healthcare to self-care?
Absolutely. Thanks, Alistair, and thanks, Gil. Well said. I love the reference to a bridge, because that's kind of how we see it as well. If we're referring to it as composite intelligence, which I believe is actually probably a more correct phrase, right? If we're talking about intelligence, for us, it's about connecting the dots. You know, what's the real power that we have here? What's the opportunity? It's about being able to more ably, more efficiently recognize the synergies. And so, you know, what are we connecting? What are the dots that we're connecting? Again, it comes back to the concept of data. What is this data? You know, data is just another word for the experiences that we as individuals have, that we can contribute to our understanding of the human existence. And so it's in order for us to better understand those, to better connect the dots between those inputs, that's the opportunity that we have now as we're moving to this next phase of being able to empower individuals to better understand our own personal health and well-being. It's for us, I love as well, John Tayson, where you're talking about being the resident skeptic. One of the opportunities that we have with AI is the ability to have an automated 10th man rule to help us mitigate cognitive biases, to be able to better recognize that we as human beings do tend to look only for the data that supports our hypothesis. And, you know, time and time again, we see examples of this, as opposed to we now have the opportunity to be able to gather all of that collective human experience in real time. And we can talk about this a bit more later today, but the ability to take all of these inputs and analyze them in real time and get true understanding and meaning from them, because we can have an automated 10th man that is examining and presenting the evidence to us. That for us is you know, the great thing about the era that we live in right now.
What does a resident skeptic, John, think about the principle of people being empowered through data and information to make more personalized decisions about their own healthcare? Is that a prime dividend behind the way we're using AI?
Well, I think resident skeptics in the general can be very enthusiastic in the specific. And I think what is interesting to me about healthcare, why it's such an interesting area to spend a decade or so, I guess now, focused on, is that when you look at the failures of machine learning in the past, they have almost always been because of the property of some people call brittleness, which is to say, you take data, you collect data from a sample, you then apply it to a population that you're trying to study, and it works just fine for a period, and then for reasons you don't really understand, it suddenly stops. And there have been great examples in finance of this, where people have made fortunes for a short period of time. Long-term credits, I think, is perhaps the best example if you want a historic note, and then suddenly they fall over. It seems, and this is a hypothesis, it seems that the likelihood is that the underlying equations that generated the data have changed. There were probably an element of human whim in there, and in the same way that you can't easily predict the length of skirts next year from the sales of lengths of skirts last year, there was a change in the underlying equations. Now, what's interesting about healthcare is that the equations don't change. And so the likelihood is, and my enthusiasm, is that probably there will be less brittleness in these systems that we build for healthcare, because the relationship between fainting and temperature hasn't changed since we were apes, and probably even before that. Now, I was very happy with this, although it does lead to one unfortunate conclusion, which is that once you've collected the data set once, you've collected it for all time. So you better make sure that you understand who owns it and where it's stored. But I was disabused of this happy fantasy by a clinical oncologist who said, no, you misunderstood. It changes because of our measurement, and our ability to measure changes and therefore the data sets change. So it isn't kind of done and dusted. I'll come back later on and talk about governance and those sorts of things, but my particular interest in this and where it fits particularly well with what other panelists have been saying is that it is about the data. The data is about you. The data on the whole comes from analog systems, and we're trying to measure it as digital data. Death, of course, is entirely binary, digital, but most things are not, which focuses us on sensors, because you've got better sensors, you get better data sets. And then on the data itself, how you can share it safely, because as somebody else said, it isn't about the individual, it's not about the self. I'll make one last comment, if I may, to answer your particular point. I think there's an enormous problem with informed consent in the use of data generally, because of what is known as the hyperbolic discount function problem, which I can expand on if you want to, but you probably all know what it is. We make bad decisions. That appears to be particularly problematic for health, particularly if it involves any kind of genetic component, because the information about me is also about my parents and my siblings and my children, and about cousins in countries I've never visited who I've never met. So I think informed consent in healthcare is deeply problematic.
Thank you for that, John. Would any of the other panelists like to comment on anything that's been said? If not, I'll move things along a little bit, and we will come back to that issue of informed consent. I know that it'd be nice to hear John from Sunderland University. Maybe we'll move on to talk about ethics. But we've just had a question in, actually, which prompts the next area that I'd quite like us to cover, which is of how we accelerate the integration of AI and the use of data into healthcare. The question sort of kicks that off. It's from Faras Abu Hana, who's with us today. He'd like to hear what the panelists to say about developing a base for AI through medical schools to make sure that students and medics that are coming through have a basic knowledge of how to use AI and how to develop it further, and what kind of impact that would have if it was more thoroughly embedded in the education process as medics and clinicians came through and became practitioners. So I don't know, possibly John from Sunderland Uni, would you like to address that to start with? And then I'm sure others will want to join in.
Yeah, absolutely. So from an educational institution standpoint, this is something that, you know, we are working with our colleagues over in healthcare. So from my background of computer science and engineering, and looking at algorithms and how we can use and understand data, and then working with our colleagues in healthcare to help them understand what the data can do and how it can help inform decisions. What I do want to quickly just go kind of back on is something that was just discussed a few moments ago by the other John around data and data sets. And I think I think that the challenges with data is it does change. Things do change. Behaviors change. The way in which we have acquired that data, we get new mechanisms, better mechanisms to gather data. So I think we have to use what's called continual data gathering. I don't think you could ever say, you've got a data set, there's my data set, that's what I'm going to use. We've got to continually gather more data, refresh our data, and add to that data pool. But to kind of look at how healthcare professionals and the next doctors and GPs understand AI, I think that comes back to my introduction when I was talking about this black box. And when doctors and I put my hand up, I'm not a medical doctor, talk about patients and problems and disease, they're going through thought processes and they're explaining their thought processes with each other, and they're explaining how they come to a decision or how they come to a conclusion or why they think a particular disease might have happened or what the solution might be. With AI and machine learning, we put all our data into the box and we get an answer out. And it's what's going on inside. What are those decisions that are happening? How, if we show a machine learning algorithm a picture of a car, how does it know it's a picture of a car? what's it looking for? Is it looking for wheels? Is it looking for contrast differences between the image? What's happening inside? And that's still something that we don't fully understand. And there's a whole new area that's developed in the past couple of years called Explainable AI, where we're trying to understand what's happening inside that black box. And I think working with colleagues in health, yes, we can explain how AI works. We can teach them algorithms. We can teach them systems and processes. But it's how we get their trust and their backing for applying those algorithms and AI to problems that they're facing. And I think that's still a big challenge around the acceptance of AI in healthcare industries.
Thanks, Sean. I'm going to come to Aman next, and then Offer, who I know is at the front line of some of these things. That question again, Aman, about the integration into healthcare and the role of practitioners and clinicians in that, and education, and how that bleeds into it.
Yeah, no, it's a great question for us. I think, the beauty of AI is that AI creates AI. As more algorithms come out, we are able to create more algorithms to ingest multi-sensor data and create more algorithms, right? So I think for us is absolutely correct in saying that, this needs to be ingrained in medical school and in training. Otherwise, you graduate medical school, you go right into, a hospital system, and and depending upon the hospital system you're in, you may be bombarded with AI. Some systems may not, maybe a little bit more nascent, but nevertheless, the future is where, like our device enables remote monitoring, right? Capability. Never before have you been able to get 6 leads of data from a patient sitting at home. You always had to wait for your every 6-month visit where you would get an EKG in the office. And so, I think that it's absolutely critical for our educational systems worldwide to start teaching physicians about digital health, teaching physicians about artificial intelligence and the benefits, rather than they approach it as, oh, now here's another system for me to learn, or here's another alert that I'm going to get, right? And it's with their feedback that we can improve our systems and platforms, right? And I think that that's very critical. It's that circular loop where, it's the responsibility of companies like ours where, it's not just deploy and dump and run, it's deploy and get feedback and improve upon our platforms and algorithms. So I absolutely agree. I don't know how we can be proactive in putting this type of curriculum together across the medical school networks. Obviously, you have, I'm sure, the large tier 1 academic institutions in the world are already teaching that. But when you look at the majority, especially physicians that are practicing in the U.S., I went to medical school myself in the Caribbean, and this technology should be taught across all spectrums of the medical school environments, not just tier 1 academic institutions worldwide. And it could be done. Zoom is a great enabler of doing that, right? So there's no reason why we can't do that, and there's no reason why us as a panel can't do that, perhaps as a more not-for-profit type of method as well. But highly critical that physicians should be comfortable with working with artificial intelligence, embrace it, not approach it as yet another thing to do.
Thanks, Aman. That's really helpful. And Offer, I'm sure you might want to expand on that a little and explore that.
Yes, thank you. I fully agree with the previous speakers about education, about the importance of education, but I also think that teaching AI for physicians is not something that we can achieve easily, and it's not something that we can, it's like throwing the responsibility on somebody else and saying, listen, you need to teach them because when they leave the university, we want them to understand what we do. I think it's our responsibility as industry to make sure that clinicians use our tools, believe our tools, and I'm not sure that education is going to be the solution. I mean, we can teach them basic terms. We cannot teach them the complex tools that our mathematicians and data scientists are using, because there's a reason why it's a separate school of education. So I think that for us, the challenge as industry, in order to make sure that people are actually using those tools and not afraid of them, is to try to move away from the black box concept. And explainability for me is the #1 challenge. Because if I'm talking to an oncologist and saying, listen, my tool can tell you with one blood test taken before treatment, what's going to be the trajectory of your patient for the next 12 months, putting aside ethical issues, putting aside self-care issues, just believe me that I can give you with very high accuracy the ability to understand if your patient is going to be alive 12 months from now with the treatment that you're going to give them. Most physicians won't believe me. I need to explain the biology. Clinicians are being taught using biology, physiology, and we need to be able to connect those dots for them and explain why we're telling them this story. Why do we see that? How it's connected to the biology. If we do that, I think that the acceptability will be much higher. I don't have the perspective, but I'm not sure how, the first MRIs, the first CTs were expected by clinicians. No clinician is asking us how is it that by using a simple blood test, draw off a little bit of a blood from the patient's vein, we can tell him what is the hemoglobin level of the patient. There's a process behind it, right? We are not taking all the blood and measuring how much hemoglobin we have, but they believe that. And we need to make sure that with AI, we are going through the same process. And I think that education here is not necessarily something that to be done at the level of the medical school. Definitely, we need to start there, but actually on the level of the assimilation of the technologies into the clinics. And this is the responsibility of the industry.
Developing that clear narrative that outlines not just the benefits, but the process is key. Gil, can I maybe come back to you and ask for your thoughts on that broad question of how we integrate AI in an accelerated form into healthcare? Maybe what might the barriers to that be and thoughts on overcoming those?
Yeah, thank you, Alistair. And I thought that Ofer and Aman's responses were illuminating because they really have come up through the system. I want to take what they've both said because there's no right or wrong here. Unfortunately, all these perspectives are essential. And I'm learning very quickly as someone who's in the field that probably if we take your moderation and this cohort of people and we listen to this conversation again and again, we're going to have a 360-degree view of the challenges and the opportunities. I'm a big follower of OncoHost and AliveCor. Actually, I think these are two leadership organizations that are actually using artificial intelligence and desire to get it right for the sake of their mission. So, I think that the two of them are important to listen to, and their enterprises are important to watch. One of the things I see from my work around the world with companies like these two and others is I think they're headed in the right direction, totally. I think the challenge is actually psychological and economic. And by that, I mean psychological. I think that many clinicians feel threatened by the thought of this adjunctive data, composite wisdom, collective IQ being dumped in the room with them, and that doctors psychologically are often trained to give answers. And they even have a word for when they don't have an answer. If you have pain and they can't explain it, it's idiopathic pain. What is idiopathic, right? Idiopathic pain. And you say, oh my God, the doctor has diagnosed me. I have idiopathic pain. And idiopathic is a nice Latin word for meaning, I don't know why you have that pain. But it's a great diagnosis, right, Aman? Right, Ophir?
Absolutely.
Right. So
it's always the right diagnosis.
Yes, that was always the right diagnosis. So I will share with someone a very brief vignette and answer your question. I had COVID in September. I was vaccinated. I was in the Ukraine, and I came back to the States, and lo and behold, I had COVID. And I had to go to the hospital. My pulse ox was about 88, bouncing 87, 88. I didn't feel any risk, but I felt, I better have it checked out. And I asked 3 doctors in succession who came into my examination room, when should I get my booster shot? The first doctor said, oh, according to the schedule, whatever that is. The second one said, oh, in a month. And the third one said, oh, I'd wait about 6 months since you have antibodies. 3 doctors in succession, 3 different answers. This is one area where artificial intelligence, which is not artificial, it's being generated, it's organic intelligence being sort of like being brought together, where to some extent, best practice medicine will be guided in the future by data being sort of like joined together from different sites. Okay, end of that story. Problem, doctors have to give an answer. It is a knee-jerk reaction. Artificial intelligence is not instead of doctors. It's not instead of doctors. It is actually almost like what we called, and Ophir will laugh at this, when I started with the Merck Manual. Once upon a time, the Merck Manual, which was published every 4 years, contained the compendium of medical wisdom. Then suddenly it had to be published almost every other year. And then it had to be republished digitally almost every other day. That's because we're accumulating faster and faster and faster more information. It is impossible, to answer your question, Alistair, for doctors who go through medical school today to learn anything but medical basics, physiology, biology, basic diagnostic techniques, and actually to learn how to ask questions. Doctors don't like to ask questions, they like to give answers. So one is artificial intelligence matched with expert medical care is actually going to make doctors better doctors. That's a problem psychologically because doctors, particularly, no offense to the surgeons here, surgeons already feel they are the best of all doctors, right, Aman? Right, Ophir? Yeah. Right? A surgeon, of course, is the finest of doctors. They don't need to know anything what they know. That's a problem. Psychologically, we need to deal with the doctor's desire to make decisions, but actually learn to question their decisions. They need a little bit of John Taysom embedded in their mindset. Okay, next, economics. Why is artificial intelligence struggling? It's not struggling because it's not great or it's not helpful. Who's going to pay for it? Who's going to pay for embedding it into a hospital system? A hospital system says, holy mackerel, I've got a whole systems department. I've got a whole IT department. Now I need to embed artificial intelligence into the system. Who's going to pay for that? How do I get reimbursed for that? And then the other aspect is, how do I support it? Who pays for that support? And then you have many companies dealing with the fragmentation of artificial intelligence. Do I buy from one company their cardiovascular artificial intelligence, another one their oncology artificial intelligence? The system, external systems fragmented. So I think this is a really important conversation because we're dealing ultimately with the obstacles to being better in curing people or preventing disease. And it is not what Ophir or Aman are doing. They're doing amazing work, world-class work. I think we've seen the enemy. It is us. I think the medical system feeds on its children.
A fabulous, but slightly sobering phrase. I mean, it seems screamingly obvious, certainly from everybody listening to this, that when it comes to pathology, diagnostics, AI has a potential to narrow down things and make all physicians and clinicians better at what they do and to save them time and energy. But there are those obvious barriers there. We'll maybe come back and talk about the economics. I think that's a really interesting point and some of the questions around investment. I'd quite like to come back to something that John from Sunderland mentioned, John Murray, which is that question of trust and ethics and building relationships with organizations and individuals who will come to rely on AI, maybe through better trust and a better understanding of the benefits it delivers. John, I don't know if you want to say something about that and maybe some of the ethical dimensions that you've been studying and spending time on.
Yeah, absolutely. How do I compete against what Gil's just said, though? I mean, some really interesting insights there. Absolutely fascinating. Yeah, so some of the work we'd done a few years ago involves some of the items stood behind me here, some robots. And we were trying to understand people's reactions to embodied AI and to robots and having robots in the home and in healthcare scenarios. And something that was mentioned earlier on in the talk was about cognitive bias. And one of the particular cognitive biases we looked at was misattribution cognitive bias, which is trying to say that everything positive is as a result of your own actions and everything negative that may happen is because of someone else and not because of what you've done. And what we found when we were engaging with some of our participants in the study was they were quite apprehensive about the robots when the robots remembered every single minutia of previous interactions with the participants. So we had participants interact over a long period of time, about 6 months the study went for. And the robot could remember what they were wearing, it could remember what was said, it could recall all the facts and all the details. And what we actually found, and there's been quite a number of media reports and papers we published on the back of this, was that when the robot was fallible and made mistakes, and these were mistakes that we put into the system, so we made the robot get details wrong when it was trying to remember previous interactions, people likened and warmed to it a bit more because they were just like people. They might make mistakes, and it kind of made us think about maybe a lot of the film and TV and media industries are trying to make AI look like this big bad wolf that's going to take over humanity. And if you think of the most famous is Terminator as a film, and some of the things that eminent researchers and professors and Stephen Hawking, for example, was worried about the singularity that was going to take over with AI. So I think we are still hesitant because of that. And in my mind, I think what Gil was saying is absolutely right, is you need AI and people and doctors, and they need to work in symbiosis together to help us understand the data. AI can manage and understand and interpret data at a much faster rate than any human could ever do. And it helps us inform our decisions rather than potentially make those decisions for us. And it's not going to replace us, I think, anytime soon. And it certainly, I think, works together. But there's also the other side of the ethics as well, and that's litigation, which I think is a real challenge and problem and worry at the moment in healthcare, particularly. I've worked with some big medical UK medical organizations in recent years looking at AI solutions to problems. And the question I always get is from their legal team, and that is, what if it makes the wrong decision? What if it gives us advice that we take that is fundamentally wrong? Who's to blame? Who's responsible for that? Is it the company that sold us the AI? Is it our doctors and our staff that are using it? Is it the programmer? There's a huge can of worms there to be opened and to be investigated. So I think that is what's causing some of the hesitancy around embracing what AI and machine learning and deep learning can provide, is that litigation is what happens if something goes wrong. And there's huge questions being asked at the moment around autonomous vehicles. The UK have just allowed the first autonomous vehicles on the road, and we're trying to understand what that means. So I think there's two factors to this from some of the research I'm doing, which is around our view, our kind of feelings towards AI. And as I say, misattribution bias was a good one that helped us have participants warm a bit more towards our robots, and litigation. So if errors do happen, which they will, it's just inevitable that mistakes will be made. Who is responsible for those mistakes? And these are still, we're still in the infancy of this technology, I think, in a lot of areas, and it's still stuff we have to work through and understand as a society.
Thanks, John. You raised some fascinating points there, leading on from Gil's comments. John Taysom, ethics, and I think, it's really interesting, that point at which the data stops and humans take responsibility for qualitative decisions. I mean, it's an interesting interface there, isn't it? Any thoughts on that, John?
Well, there's so many good comments there from previous speakers. I just want to touch on a couple, if I may, before I come back to the specific question. The issue with autonomous vehicles actually has some relevance here. It's sort of obvious, but sometimes gets forgotten, that we train machine learning on historic data. You can only train machine learning on observations, and the observations have necessarily passed. So in the same way that trying to use machine learning to steer an autonomous vehicle is like trying to drive a car by looking through a rearview mirror, it's difficult if you take the human out of the loop and try to rely only on the system, which has been trained on data that's been observed. Imagine the first COVID patient turning up at the hospital and being met by a machine learning system versus a young and probably rather frightened doctor. There are reasons why we have had difficulty in making anything remotely intelligent that is not, or with human intelligence, that is not a human. We have this extraordinary vessel, the eye, which is in effect an extension of the brain, which is a bandwidth we can't even appreciate to collect data. We often don't know why we collect the data. I'm still a big fan of broadsheet newspapers because I get from it all kinds of peripheral information that I don't get when I read news online. And having the human in the room with the patient is something which I think we will never replace. Not least because, again, going back to an earlier point, when the decision is taken by the system, someone has to communicate it to the patient. And very frequently, the doctor won't necessarily simply blurt out the output from the test. Not least because he probably doesn't always necessarily, he or she doesn't probably always know what the next stage is. But even when the doctor is certain, explaining with some kind of empathy, bearing in mind that communicating the information is itself going to impact the outcome for the patient, is skilled, sensitive, I suspect irreplaceable. So data collection, very difficult to replace. Communication back to the patient, very hard to replace. On the point of education, I totally agree, both that it's a requirement, but also it probably is broader than the topic of training doctors. We badly need a curriculum to teach digital civics, how to be an empowered, effective democratic citizen in this strange world we've built for the next generation. That goes much broader than just medicine. One part of that education must be to explain that machine learning, artificial intelligence is just an application of probability. And it's just statistics in a tuxedo. The minute people forget that and imagine it has some kind of animus that is above and beyond that, is a fatal point. I'll read you just one quote from Professor Anders Hansen at the Cambridge Department of Applied Mathematics and Theoretical Physics. He says, many AI systems are unstable, and it's becoming a major liability, especially as they are increasingly used in high-risk areas, such as disease diagnosis. So I focus on these areas, as I probably ought to have explained earlier on, by investing in companies that are working in them. So I have an investment in a company that's specifically looking at explanation of AI. Now, if you want to frighten a young machine learning expert, ask them how they deal with autocorrelation. Most of them look at you with utter mystery. They don't know what on earth you're talking about. But it's a fact that time as a variable is dealt with broadly in machine learning as if it was any other variable. But how can you possibly expect to determine cause and effect unless you recognize that there is a time component to that expression? So one of my companies called Pometry, based in the UK, do have a look at the company, is trying to look at that particular issue and take time out separately using a temporal graph analysis approach. So coming back to your particular point, I think the area that really interests me is, as you say, it's the, well, I christen it, I think of it as being the digital to analog, analog to digital problem. How you collect the data and then how you output the other end. And I think that is an area where, you know, somebody earlier on said we're in infancy. One area I do know it works extremely well, and I think it's probably because this brittleness problem is less of an issue in medical data, is in spotting small node carcinoma in the lung. And one of my companies, UK company, just has FDA approval for the application of machine learning to diagnosis of small node carcinoma in the lung. And to the point about costs, which I think Gil made, it is the #1 or #2 killer in almost every country still, lung cancer, not just from smoking, but also from particulates in the air. So that's an example where an application of machine learning can directly impact economics, both reducing the impact of the patient, but also for society. And why this is important is because the spend of GDP on health is rapidly rising, and it will continue to do so as we live longer. And this is starting to be potentially destabilizing for society.
Okay, thanks, John. And I do want to come back to that question of who invests and who pays for those long-term benefits, you know, that may be counted in years rather than months once you've invested in them. But just before we do, I want to give Ofer or Aman the chance to maybe just come in and say a few final words about the question of ethics and that divide between digital and analog that John touched on, you know, that relationship of trust where clinicians, physicians and organizations come to rely on the data to make better decisions. Any thoughts, Ofer or Aman, on that before we move on?
So maybe 2 points on my side. I think this is two interesting aspects to it. So the first one is, I think that especially in medicine, since one of the first things they teach us in medical school is first do know how. Now, how of course, is a relative thing, but this is one of the biggest barriers today to innovation in medicine. And what I found in our course and in my previous companies is that sometimes you need to regress your product when you are first approaching the market. And instead of being very ambitious and very brave and tell a physician whether to treat the patient or not, or whether the patient has a cancer or not, move to the story, and I think John mentioned it, move to a different story, discuss probabilities. Okay, so you're not taking the responsibility from the hands of the physician on one hand, and you're de-risking your product on the other hand. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't do that, right? We can give a very, very clear answer, probably better than what is currently being, the tools that the physician is currently using, but on purpose, we are regressing our product in order to enable physicians to swallow the technology earlier. And another thing I would like to say about ethics, again, I think a responsibility of the company, of the industry is, there's a lot of hype around AI. And there's a huge gap, really huge gap between what clinicians, oncologists, people that are reviewing papers in peer-reviewed journals know about AI and what is being published. And sometimes we can see abstracts or even full papers that are looking at very small cohorts of patients or doing stuff like cross-validation in order to validate the AI. Those things are not helping. Those things are basically causing, I think, more harm because there is no way you can validate an algorithm on a cohort of 47 or 45 patients. This is a paper you only find in one of the high impact outlets. Again, going back to our responsibilities in industry, make sure that we are using the data and presenting the data and sharing it with our peers in a way that is ethical and not cause collateral harm by presenting data that is immature and probably wrong.
Thank you.
I would just add that, I think when you talk about trust, there's two layers of trust. One is trust with the patient, and one is trust with the physician. Trust with the patient really starts with ensuring that, when we develop algorithms, we're not developing algorithms that are riddled with, false positives or false negatives, and that we do our best to make sure that if an algorithm is ready for release, that we then release it, right? And then obviously, at AliveCor, we have FDA clear algorithms, and we're CE marked and available in over 40 countries, but nevertheless, we are working diligently on making sure that what we release the best. The trust from the clinicians, what we find often really comes down to, does this integrate with my workflow, my current standard of care, what I do today? And I think we touched upon this a little bit about, integrations, and, Gil, very well, the challenges of integrating into EMRs in the US. There's 500 plus of them. And we have to find innovative ways to get around that. I mean, we just integrated we announced yesterday our integration with the GEMU system. And that gets us in front of cardiologists and into those healthcare systems that use GEMUs. But there's a long way to go when it comes down to other types of EMRs that are used, obviously just not in the US, but throughout the world. And I think that's one of those statements that you said, Gil, where it's like we get in our own way, where we've made it so complex to get integrated with those. I mean, startups just don't have the bandwidth and capability to put resources behind those integration efforts. And oftentimes that delays tools that may be beneficial to humanity to be used by clinicians to improve practice, improve care, and make those better informed decisions. And I truthfully don't know a solution. I think if anybody had a solution, to be, perhaps a billionaire by now, but, it's one of those things where we're going to increase our algorithms. Other companies are going to be increasing other algorithms. You see more and more technology, more and more remote patient solutions coming out. And it's just going to be getting harder and harder to integrate into the systems, but we kind of get in our own way when it comes down to that.
Thanks very much, Aman. We've talked about the economics of accelerating AI into healthcare more thoroughly. Maybe, Simon, if we could come back and ask you maybe to sort of preface a short discussion on that and how we encourage the kind of investment required to let AI, flourish and achieve its full potential in healthcare.
And Aman, I was just saying, thanks very much for sharing your experiences. We certainly also have had our experiences in the challenges of integration of cutting edge software with legacy systems. Let's put it that way. But it's a great point. It's a great subject, and spot on, Gil. Who pays for it? There's a lot of cost, first of all, embedding software, but even prior to that, it's all the lobbying work that goes into, it's the marketing, it's the PR, it's how does one get acceptance and recognition for the fact that one has software that contributes significantly, and the approvals, the regulatory hurdles that one needs to go through in order to get that sort of acceptance. And of course, you've got the long-term question of, how does software, because again, the software is, anyone who has developed software in the past will tell you, the real science is the ongoing maintenance and support of that software. So with us, I mean, if you take a look just at one particular opportunity we have in healthcare, McKinsey's estimate is that for the average top 20 pharma company, so for big pharma, on average, just being able to tap into and adopt advanced analytics is going to have a value add of at least $300 million a year. That's significant commercial value. And that's what it comes down to at the end of the day, putting the banker's venture capitalist hat, the investor hat on, You know, have I got something? Are we looking at something? Are we talking about? Are we investing in software that has and adds significant commercial value? And just in drug development, and we all know it, on average, we're talking about a development cost in excess of $1 billion per drug. If we are talking about approaches, if we're talking about innovation, if we're talking about software, you know, we're talking about AI that adds value, that helps reduce cost and risk in that process, well, then it has significant commercial value. And, you know, the thing about capitalism that's often misunderstood is it's only if something has commercial value, i.e. if its value is recognized, and the clue is, you know, how universally is it recognized? If something has value, it will attract capital to support it. Now, for us, you know, one example of what I'm talking about here, clinical decision support systems, Professor Johan Fastbaum, the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, has developed algorithms that can identify the potential for adverse drug reactions in a polypharma situation, right? Who else is doing this globally? It's been in use in Sweden for over 10 years now. If you look globally, millions of people are dying every year from adverse drug reactions. You know, we talk about top 10 causes of death. Well, one of them that's completely avoidable is adverse drug reactions. Except who has access to it? Again, it's down a question of how do we get this software, these algorithms that have been developed, that have been proven, how do we get them in a form that can be embedded, that can be implemented into existing legacy systems? And for us, you know, one of the answers to that was another company, Strong Room, based in Australia, that came up with an innovative pharmacies management platform. So everything related to more effective, safer management of medications in medication treatment programs. And so putting the two of them together, we now have a compelling offer for anyone who's offering treatment, but also anyone who's connected with a medical treatment program, if it's the end user themselves, if it's a family member or a carer, just to have that reassurance, you know, and coming back to what you're talking about, Gil, with, and Aman as well, with the issues of trust and the stress that doctors and physicians are under in having to give an answer and being able to know that the answer they're giving is absolutely to the best of our understanding and the best of the culmination of all of our human understanding on the subject. It is the best answer, and it is a quality and a safe treatment program that is being prescribed. So that's what, from our perspective as investors, what we're looking for. We're looking for those add-ons. You know, it's a little bit like the old analogy about in the gold rush, and this is where we feel we are. We're on the verge of the next great revolution in how information and the intelligence that we've been gathering and the ability to process that information is going to revolutionize our ability to better understand our existence. And that for us is what creates wealth. It's new understandings. And you know, the old adage that knowledge is power. Well, anyone on the planet today that can access the internet has access to knowledge that is unprecedented in the history of mankind, and is by extension more powerful than emperors only a few generations ago. So we now have access to all this data. How do we process it, and how do we get the access to it? So again, coming back to the gold rush analogy, it's not who owns the claim and is able to hoard that and tap into and hoard that vein for themselves, but it's who's able to supply it so that everyone universally can access it and benefit from it. And that's what we like, and those are the sorts of founders and opportunities that we're looking for and we're supporting, because that's where we feel the best opportunity to create a meaningful and positive impact for the world we live in can be found.
Thank you, Simon. That's enormously helpful. Gil, would you like to add something to that?
Thank you, Alistair, and thank you, Simon. I'm going to steal a card from John Taysom's deck here. I'm going to be the resident skeptic for a moment. Culture crushes innovation, always. And despite people's enthusiasm, I think we have to keep in mind that science and medicine combined have a culture that's connected to them for millennia. Since Da Vinci started to dissect the human body and make his sketches, the culture of science has evolved, but it's linear. Science happens to be a linear profession. Artificial intelligence is not linear. It is essentially part of composite wisdom or pattern recognition. Machine learning is actually pulling in different patterns and helping bold clinicians assess and have expanded perspective. And I don't think that doctors really want anything radical. I don't think doctors want to be disrupted. I think they want to see evolution. I think one of the reasons why, for instance, AliveCor is so successful in its mission is that the profession of biotelemetry or Holter monitors existed for decades. And what AliveCor did was it didn't disrupt the category, it evolved the category. Artificial intelligence wasn't disruptive to biotelemetry. It was value added and evolutionary. And I think that Aman and his colleagues recognized that they needed to evolve a necessary prevention so that doctors could track their patients who are at risk for arrhythmia and see how they could use that data to better assess. I think OncoHost will be successful because oncologists are analytic. They're not linear. And because their culture is analytic, they're curious about genetics. They're curious about cell structure. They're curious about the predictive nature of what that means. They want more information, and more information. So I think that we're talking about artificial intelligence, composite wisdom, machine learning in the general. But when you look at medicine in the specifics, you find that it's not all things to all clinicians, to all medics, to all doctors. It's different things to different people. And certain doctors don't want you to tamper with their understanding of disease and its linear pathology. That's one thing I would ask all of us to consider. So not all areas of artificial intelligence will be embraced at the same moment. Some will be embraced sooner than others. I won't sort of critique any particular medical specialty right now, but I will say that because the cardiovascular associations, American College of Cardiology, European Society of Cardiology, American Heart Association, and other large organizations have always been assessed with data and patterns, they're probably more adaptable to artificial intelligence. Same with the ESMO and with ASCO, always been very obsessed with data and looking at data connections, even minute connections. So artificial intelligence there is an accelerator of change, of scientific change. But I want to just point out that I see certain challenges ahead for all of us. I'd be very interested in hearing the panel's perspective on this. One, during the COVID period, about 80% of clinical trials ground to a halt. It's picking up again. It's picking up again. Certainly, oncology survived the worst of it, but neurology, for instance, collapsed during COVID. I mean, clinical trials in neurology they just weren't happening because people did not want to come to a central site location. The value of artificial intelligence, and just for the record, I don't like the word, I don't like the term, because I don't think it's really descriptive of what we're really doing with this information, with this intelligence. It's really composite wisdom, but neither here nor there. I think what happened was the world of decentralized everything from where, for those of you who have Amazon in your country, You don't go to stores any longer. You don't hang out in malls. You get everything online. That's decentralized, right? When you're ordering online, you've decentralized the consumer experience. Well, the same with science. I think artificial intelligence is actually going to be a necessity because we're going to have to discover cures for diseases faster than ever before. Artificial intelligence is an accelerator tool. It's an accelerator tool to wisdom. It's an accelerator tool to decision. It's an accelerator tool to innovation. And so I think what's going to happen is groups like ours, this conversation today, are going to have to get our act together and decide what we want to do to prioritize the use of artificial intelligence and put the pedal to the metal in order to sustain and save lives. I will say, to the credit of two of the panelists here, cardiology, heart disease, and cancer are going to be two of those areas that pedal to the metal. As I said before, non-communicable diseases, that's the way to go. We can tell if you're pre-diabetic and you have a genetic history of diabetes in the lineage, probably you're going to be diabetic. How do we intercede? If you have issues or mental health issues in your family, probably we need to find a way to track those. So I think that looking at the pathway of clearly non-communicable diseases like Ofer and Aman have, I would keep that in our radar screen. But again, I end with culture crushes innovation. Don't forget it.
We won't, Gil. Yeah, and I'm sure that's something that that we'll all take with us from this discussion. You've teed up sort of a discussion about the future there, Gil, and priorities. I'm going to sort of go around the panel and ask for views on looking towards the future, the priorities with reference to the challenges, the opportunities, and the dividend provided by AI, or composite wisdom, as you call it, in healthcare, Gil. Maybe starting with John Taysom. John, your thoughts on looking forward, no time scale, 5 years, 10 years, the big priorities and what we need to do to convert those, all that potential into results.
Yeah, can I start just by, trumping Gil's skepticism with some skepticism? I don't want my physician to be an innovator. I don't want the pilot to change the frigging aircraft in mid-flight. I want the system to improve the airplane. And I want the system to help the doctor to be harnessing innovation, but I don't want the physician to be innovative. Now, having said that, there are very innovative physicians. And one of my companies, a company called Timber Health, is a young ENT specialist still working in the NHS, who's designed a very simple, better scope for removing the gunge from your ear and taking a good picture of the eardrum, which is useful in diagnostics of many sorts. The particular special feature is there's no water involved, so it can be used in third world countries where there's difficulty with getting sterile water. To your more general point and to the question you asked, I think the two areas have to be data, because without that, none of this really works anyway. People who focus on machine learning more than I do, I'm sure will confirm that there is no, in inverted commas, algorithm. There's just a bunch of data and a framework, a scaffold, and you pour the data into the scaffold and the weights are calculated, and that then represents, if you like, the process. It's about the data. And so we need to ensure the data is complete, that we don't have bias in the collection of the data. And we need to ensure that the data is accurate and is stored in a governance structure that reports to us, the patients, not necessarily to either the government or to any individual profit-seeking organization. It may not be my data in the sense I can deny you it, but you have an obligation to look after that data, to steward it, to be a good governor of it. And that's an area of artificial intelligence which is now growing in stature, which is the governance of the data that feeds in. The UK government was quite early to spot this, and Dame Wendy Hall, Professor Wendy Hall, wrote a paper for the government about 4 years ago recommending there should be data trusts for the storage of data. And I think that's starting to happen. It happens within the NHS sort of naturally because it is anyway a trust structure. It's an unusual organisation, the NHS. It's not one single legal entity. It's a number of individual trusts which have a geographic focus. And Privatar, the company that I helped start, is used by the NHS to enable a distributed, federated data sharing infrastructure, which ensures that the data is used ethically according to regulation and is not privacy invasive. So I would start with the data. Secondly, what I think is interesting and a sort of a big picture thought maybe is that we've focused a lot on genetics in the use of machine learning, partly because genetics looks a bit like code if you're a coder. And so people sort of get it and they recognize the problem. And we've had extraordinary advances. The area that's taken less investment is the analysis of the phenotype, which of course, in terms of the disease presented is as important. That area is starting to get some investment. A wonderful company called Pangea Data out of Imperial University here in London, which is applying natural language processing, unsupervised NLP, to unstructured patient records. So as long as it's computer readable, it can be in unstructured form. They ingest the patient record and they output phenotype classifications, which are used by pharmaco to stratify clinical trials. Now, what that does is it gets you from the drug discovery through to application at scale faster. So I think those are two areas I would pick, the data collection, storage, governance, and a refocus perhaps on the overall health, the phenotype as well as the genotype.
Thank you for that, John. Again, starting to round up, John Murray, your thoughts on translating all this potential into results and what the priorities are over the years ahead?
Absolutely. Well, just listen to what some of the other speakers have said, just absolutely fascinating, work and ideas. And the future does look, I think, in terms of the application of AI, really strong. What I am going to do is throw a slight curveball into the discussions, just as a kind of wrap up and ponder for future thought, is to take what Simon said and change one of the words slightly. So I absolutely agree, knowledge is power, but data is power. I think who has the data has the power. And again, what John was just saying about the control and the organization of that data, and what Gil was also saying around kind of cultures and identity as well, is something we really need to think about. With more and more data being generated, more and more AI systems being used in industry and in healthcare and in protein folding and drug discovery, is security and how security is maintained around data. So there's a lot of research being done now, and a lot of people able to create, you may have heard of scans and the application of these adversarial networks. So for example, another area of that AI is used is in security detection. So you might have a camera at home monitoring your property, and it'll detect whether people come onto your drive and it'll send you alerts. People have created, for all intents and purposes, invisibility shields, and you literally just need to hold up a little colored symbol and the camera can't recognize you. The AI system can't detect you, can't see you. And how do we maintain the integrity of the algorithms and the integrity of the application of the data? And I'm not talking security in terms of people stealing and selling on data, but getting access to the AI models and being able to counter those models. When we have such an application of technology such as AI and a growth, there is always going to be people that are going to look to profit from that illicitly, and there's always going to be kind of cyber crimes and other crimes around the use of that information and that data. So it's how do we think about protecting ourselves going forward and making sure that it's resilient, it's robust, and secure. And I think that's something we really need to think about. And with the advancements of AI, machine learning, I think that's not getting as much attention as I would like. And when we talk about trust and when we talk about having trust in a system, we need to trust the data, and we need to know the data is right. We need to know the data hasn't been manipulated, but also the models that are applied to that data, that they've not been compromised in any way. And, you know, some of the research I've been doing with my PhD students around, inverted quotes, call it invisibility cloaks, around being able to trick AI systems, being able to make them think a picture of a panda is a picture of a car. How do we have that resilience and the trust from that perspective is something I'll just leave there just for people to ponder and think about.
Great, thank you, John. Offer, final thoughts on priorities?
Yeah, I really related to what John said about I don't want my physician to be an innovator. I want the system to improve it. I think it's really a very important point. And I think that right now we face a huge challenge with regulatory authorities, and I'm talking specifically about the FDA, because the current process that we have doesn't really allow for the development, for the evolution of the tool that you develop, because you submit your version and then 2 years later you get it approved. What you have in your hands after 2 years is a completely different animal than the one that you submitted. And I think that we need to develop together with them, because at the end of the day, most physicians are not innovators. Most physicians, we look for the FDA clearance, we look for the CA clearance or any other regulatory agency. But we need to develop with those guys the framework that will enable us to use a tool that is evolving over time and is developing with every patient that you add to the system, and find a way to get your product approved while it evolves and not only after the fact.
Great, thanks very much, Offer. Simon, could I come to you next for your sort of rounding up comments on what you think the big priorities are as we move forward?
Thanks, Alistair. I like to joke, Wright's law trumps Moore's law. Now, as economies of scale are affecting the rate of pace of development over time, developments are integrated with new approaches, new technologies, that much more efficiently, that much more quickly. Gil referenced the Merck manuals. Aman said it best, AI creates AI, and both Johns referred to our ability to process and understanding data as it's evolving. That for us is the future. And we feel that as this continues to evolve and as more approaches and more technologies and more understandings are developed that empower us as individuals to better manage our own personal health, nutrition, and wellness, that this will lead to prolonged health spans, prolonged lives that we can live to the peak of our potential and can contribute even longer over our lifespan more productively. So for us, the future's shaping up pretty nicely.
I agree. I dream of a world where my Amex doesn't work at McDonald's because it's preventing me from hurting myself more. And I say that half jokingly. I think that, there's one aspect that we could focus on healthcare for self-care, right? But it goes beyond that on all the other decisions we make, where we live, what we eat, genetics, obviously, which may or may not be in control. But that would be quite neat.
As you're talking, Aman, again, any other final thoughts on the big priorities?
I just have one return to the point about costs, because we learned in COVID that one way to understand the impact of COVID was not to look at the individual death certificates, not least because there's no systematic way of recording them, going back to Gil's earlier point. But we learned to look at excess deaths. In other words, we learned to look at the macro rather than the micro. And I think one of the things that we need to think about, given we have an aging population in most countries, represented here anyway, is that the GDP consumed by health will carry on rising. So the focus that I've been taking when I'm investing is not to have a 10% improvement in outcomes as judged by medics, but to have a massive reduction in cost for the same outcomes. Better outcomes if possible, but that's not the focus. The focus is massive reduction in cost. And that, I think, is an area where machine learning innovation can really have a significant impact. I'll give you a very simple example. Sadly, alongside COVID, there's been mental health epidemic, and there just aren't enough people who are trained to be able to deliver this. And one of my companies based in Cambridge, ISO, provides online CBT. Now, what's clever about that is that they now have enough data, and they're able to protect the data so that it can be used in an appropriate manner. To use machine learning on that data, on the sessions, so that they can improve the treatment. Now, that's a really great example of machine learning being used in an area where there hasn't been a lot of focus and didn't seem necessarily would be appropriate, but the cost reductions can be considerable. So I would say focus on the macro, look at the total GDP, and focus on the system innovation rather than the individual.
Thanks for that, John. And we started, Gil, with you, so I'm going to give you the final word on your thoughts on the big priorities as we look forward.
Well, I think, first of all, everybody should listen very carefully to what all the panelists said today. Alistair, first of all, a hat tip to you for amazing moderation, and of course to our hosts, Health Tech World, for bringing this panel together. It's very, very appreciated. I think that this conversation gives our audience, those that will see this conversation on YouTube, and that will really add up into the hundreds and thousands of people, a very good perspective. But I would say I'm going to give a few words that I think summarize my thoughts and maybe everybody's thoughts. One, ethics. The ethics of information. Who owns what? Two, the economics of information. What's it valuable and to who? And how much will you pay for it? Or how much will you save from it? Three, patients, people's well-being. That's really what this is all about. It's not the system for the sake of the system. It's the system sometimes thinks it's its own customer, right? Who is the customer? The patient. Ultimately, we're here to serve the patient. As a industry colleague, Craig Lipset once said to me, I said, we have to make sure patients have a seat at the table. He said, seat at the table? It's their table. We wouldn't exist if it weren't for them. So I think we have to remember it's all about making people well, healthier, surviving. And then I would say, sadly, self-awareness. Self-awareness is a form of intelligence. We as a system, as leaders of a system, of people committed to people's well-being, have to become far more mindful of our biases, our anxieties, our fears around change. And if we don't, all of the innovations of the world will never penetrate the system, because we will do our utmost to build walls and keep it out. If we're mindful of who we're seeking to serve, people like ourselves, our parents, our spouses, our partners, our children, I think we'll be more mindful that we want the very best of innovation possible to help them. Alistair, again, great moderation, and thank you for having us.
Thank you, Gil. I do feel as though this conversation could go on and on, because it's been fascinating, and it's been a privilege actually to listen to all of our panelists. But we did say we'd finish at 12 o'clock. So I'd like to thank everybody that's watched. And again, once the content's up on YouTube, please share it as widely as you can. If you have a look at the Health Tech World website and social media feeds, there'll be lots of nice little tailored clips that you can share with friends and colleagues in your networks. Please do so. I'd like to say an enormous thank you to all of our panelists for contributing so fully and so frankly and in such a fascinating way. It really has been a tremendous discussion. And I hope we can do this again, maybe, and pick up some of these themes and expand on them further. Particularly as quite a lot of our panelists I know have got up very early this morning because we've got different time zones at play here. So thank you very much indeed on behalf of Health Tech World for contributing to the discussion today. And I hope whatever time it is and whichever time zone you're in, you enjoy the rest of the day, and it's a happy, healthy and fulfilling day for everybody. Thank you very much indeed.